My name is Marcus, and at 29, I never imagined that a routine surgery would cost me everything I'd built. Or so I thought. 3 weeks ago, while I was unconscious in an ICU bed fighting for my life, my older brother Dylan systematically dismantled my $2 million logistics company, transferred ownership to himself, and convinced our entire family that I was mentally unstable and unfit to run a business. When I woke up to find my life's work stolen and my bank accounts emptied, I was devastated. But Dylan made one critical mistake. He never read the fine print of the partnership agreement I'd made him sign 2 years earlier. If you're wondering why I'm sitting in the boardroom of what used to be my company, wearing a smile while my brother packs his desk in handcuffs, stick around. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, Dylan and I couldn't have been more different. He was 3 years older, naturally charismatic, and seemed to glide through life on charm and good looks. I was the quiet one, the planner, the kid who spent summers reading business books while other children played video games. Our father, Robert Chen, owned a small auto parts store, and our mother, Jennifer, worked as a school administrator. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable until Dad's store went under when I was 16. The collapse happened fast. A big box retailer moved into our neighborhood, and within 6 months, Dad's 40-year-old business was hemorrhaging money. I watched him age 10 years in 6 months, saw the stress fractures appear in my parents' marriage, witnessed the slow erosion of everything stable in our family. Dylan, who was 19 and in college, seemed largely immune to the crisis. He'd call home occasionally, asking for money for textbooks or social events, apparently oblivious to the fact that there was no money left to send. But I was there for every late-night argument between my parents, every phone call with creditors, every desperate attempt to save what couldn't be saved. The experience burned something deep into my psyche. The absolute necessity of control, of backup plans, of never being caught unprepared again. While Dylan partied through his college years, changing majors 3 times and eventually dropping out junior year, I was laser-focused on one goal, building something that could never be taken away. I started small during my senior year of high school, buying damaged electronics from insurance companies and refurbishing them for resale. It wasn't glamorous work. I'd spend hours in our garage, replacing screens on smartphones and rebuilding motherboards on laptops, but it was profitable. By graduation, I was clearing $500 a week, enough to help with the family's grocery bills and still save for college. At Arizona State University, I majored in supply chain management while expanding my electronics business. I hired other students to help with refurbishment, established relationships with local repair shops, and started exploring bulk purchasing agreements with manufacturers. Dylan would visit occasionally, usually when he needed money or a place to crash between apartments. He'd look around my cramped dorm room, which doubled as a mini warehouse, and shake his head with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "You know there's more to life than work, right?" he'd say, stepping over boxes of inventory to reach my mini fridge. "When's the last time you went to a party? Dated someone? Had fun?" I'd usually just shrug and get back to my spreadsheets. Fun was watching my bank account grow. Fun was the thrill of negotiating a better deal with suppliers. Fun was the moment when a particularly challenging repair finally worked perfectly. Dylan never understood that drive, that hunger. To him, money was something that appeared when you needed it, usually from family or friends or some temporary job. To me, money was security, freedom, and the difference between thriving and merely surviving. After graduation, I took a job with FedEx to learn the logistics industry from the inside. I spent 2 years studying their operations, understanding the intricate dance of warehouses, transportation networks, and inventory management systems. Every day, I was gathering intelligence for my real plan, starting my own company that could compete with the giants by being faster, more flexible, and more responsive to small and medium-sized businesses. Zenith Flow Logistics was born in 2019 in a 2,000-square-foot warehouse I rented in Tempe. The name reflected my philosophy, reaching the peak of efficiency through smooth, uninterrupted flow of goods and information. I specialized in last-mile delivery for e-commerce companies, offering same-day and next-day services that the big carriers couldn't match for smaller volumes. My background in electronics repair had taught me to be meticulous, to think systematically, and to never accept good enough when perfect was achievable. The first year was brutal. I worked 18-hour days, personally driving delivery routes during the day and handling customer service calls at night. I slept on a cot in the warehouse office, showered at a nearby gym, and survived on energy bars and gas station coffee. Dylan would occasionally visit, usually to ask for money or to suggest I was working too hard. He'd been bouncing between jobs since dropping out of college, a few months as a car salesman, a stint in real estate that ended when the market softened, various entrepreneurial ventures that never seemed to generate actual revenue. "You're killing yourself for what?" he'd ask, watching me sort packages at midnight. "You could make decent money managing someone else's business without all this stress." But I knew what he didn't, that every sleepless night was an investment, every sacrifice a down payment on freedom. By the end of year 1, Zenith Flow was handling 200 deliveries per day. By the end of year 2, we'd grown to 500 daily deliveries, and I'd hired 6 full-time employees and leased a fleet of 12 delivery vehicles. The breakthrough came in year 3, when Cloud Commerce, a rapidly growing e-commerce platform, awarded us an exclusive contract for their Arizona operations. Suddenly, Zenith Flow was handling 2,000 deliveries daily, and revenue jumped from $800,000 annually to $2.4 million. I hired 20 more employees, leased a 15,000-square-foot warehouse, and began exploring expansion into Nevada and New Mexico. That's when Dylan started paying attention. He'd always been dismissive of my little delivery business, but when I bought a house in Scottsdale and traded my 10-year-old Honda for a new Tesla, his attitude shifted. Suddenly, he was asking detailed questions about the operation, suggesting ways he could help, hinting that maybe it was time for him to settle down and focus on something substantial. I was initially skeptical. Dylan had never shown sustained interest in any endeavor, and his track record with money was abysmal. But he was family, and some part of me, the part that remembered how isolated and driven I'd become, thought maybe working together could be good for both of us. Dylan was naturally good with people in ways I wasn't. Customers liked him, employees responded to his easy humor, and he had a gift for making complex logistics sound simple and reliable. Against my better judgment, I offered him a position as Director of Client Relations. The salary was generous, $75,000 annually plus bonuses tied to customer retention. For the first time in years, Dylan seemed genuinely excited about work. He threw himself into the role, learning our systems, building relationships with existing clients, and helping secure several new contracts. For 6 months, everything went smoothly. But then, the small signs started appearing. Clients would mention conversations with Dylan about future expansion plans that I knew nothing about. Employees would reference policy changes Dylan had discussed that hadn't been approved. I'd find him in my office after hours, claiming he was just catching up on paperwork, but always near my computer or filing cabinets. When I confronted him about overstepping his authority, Dylan's response was hurt surprise. "I'm just trying to help the business grow," he'd say. "I thought we were partners in this." We weren't partners, and I made that clear. Zenith Flow was my company, built with my vision and my sacrifice. Dylan was an employee, a valued employee, but an employee nonetheless. The distinction seemed to wound him more than I'd expected, and I began to notice a subtle shift in his behavior. He became more secretive about his activities, more defensive when questioned, and increasingly critical of my management decisions in conversations with other staff. I should have fired him then, should have trusted my instincts about the growing tension between us. But Dylan was family, and firing family felt like admitting failure on a level that went beyond business. Instead, I decided to formalize our relationship in a way that would protect the company while giving Dylan a greater sense of investment in our success. The partnership agreement I drafted was carefully constructed to address my concerns while appearing to meet Dylan's desire for recognition. On paper, it made him a 20% partner in Zenith Flow, entitled to profits and input on major decisions. But the fine print, buried in 12 pages of dense legal language, contained specific provisions that I thought would never be necessary. Provisions about mental incapacity, unauthorized changes to corporate structure, and the automatic dissolution of partnership rights under certain circumstances. Dylan signed it eagerly, clearly excited to finally be a real partner in the business. He didn't read it carefully, and he certainly didn't have a lawyer review it. To him, it was validation, proof that his older brother finally recognized his contributions and potential. I thought the agreement would solve our problems, give Dylan the sense of ownership he seemed to crave while maintaining my control over day-to-day operations. It was meant to be a safeguard, a way to prevent future conflicts by clearly defining roles and responsibilities. I never imagined it would become the weapon that would ultimately destroy him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For nearly 18 months after Dylan signed the partnership agreement, Zenith Flow experienced what I can only describe as its golden period. The combination of my operational expertise and Dylan's natural charm with clients created a synergy I hadn't anticipated. Our customer retention rate jumped to 97%, the highest in our industry sector, and we began receiving referrals at a pace that strained our capacity to onboard new clients effectively. Dylan thrived in his expanded role. He developed a comprehensive client relationship management system, organizing quarterly business reviews, holiday events, and even a client appreciation golf tournament that became an annual tradition. Watching him work a room full of logistics managers and procurement directors was like watching a masterclass in relationship building. He remembered personal details about their families, their hobbies, their business challenges, and somehow made each person feel like they were his most important client. The financial results spoke for themselves. In the 12 months following the partnership agreement, Zenith Flow's revenue grew from $2.4 million to $3.8 million. We expanded our fleet to 35 vehicles, hired 47 employees, and opened a satellite operation in Las Vegas. The warehouse in Tempe was operating at maximum capacity, forcing us to lease additional space across town for overflow inventory. But success brought new challenges that began to expose fundamental differences in how Dylan and I viewed the business. Where I saw controlled growth and sustainable practices, Dylan saw untapped potential and missed opportunities. Our monthly partnership meetings, initially collaborative and productive, gradually became sessions where we talked past each other with increasing frequency. "We're thinking too small," Dylan would argue, gesturing at charts showing our steady growth trajectory. "Cloud Commerce wants to expand into California. They're basically offering to triple our contract volume, and we're hesitating because of capacity concerns. We could lease more warehouses, hire more drivers, maybe even acquire a smaller competitor." I'd counter with spreadsheets showing our cash flow patterns, debt-to-equity ratios, and the seasonal fluctuations that could devastate an over-leveraged operation. Sustainable growth means building infrastructure before we need it, not after. If Cloud Commerce's California expansion fails, or if they decide to bring logistics in-house, rapid expansion could bankrupt us. These weren't just business disagreements. They reflected deeper philosophical differences about risk, control, and the purpose of entrepreneurship. Dylan saw business as a vehicle for adventure, for pushing boundaries and seizing opportunities regardless of the potential consequences. I saw it as a complex system requiring careful management, where one miscalculation could destroy years of careful progress. The tension came to a head during our expansion into the Las Vegas market. Dylan had identified a local company, Desert Express Delivery, that was struggling financially but had established relationships with several major retailers. The owner, Catherine Martinez, was looking to sell for $450,000, a price that Dylan argued was a steal considering their client base and warehouse infrastructure. I spent weeks analyzing Desert Express's financials, and what I found was deeply troubling. Their struggles weren't due to temporary market conditions or poor marketing. They had fundamental operational inefficiencies that were bleeding money consistently. Their cost per delivery was 23% higher than industry standards, their driver retention rate was abysmal, and they had outstanding lawsuits from 3 former employees alleging safety violations. "This isn't an opportunity," I told Dylan during a heated meeting in my office. "It's a trap. Desert Express is failing because they can't execute basic logistics operations profitably. Buying them means inheriting their problems, their liabilities, and their toxic workplace culture." Dylan's response revealed how differently we viewed business challenges. Every company has problems, Marcus. That's why they're for sale. The question is whether we're smart enough to fix what they couldn't. Catherine Martinez has been running this company like a mom-and-pop operation. We have systems, processes, technology. We could turn Desert Express around in 6 months. What followed was our first serious argument as partners. Dylan accused me of being paralyzed by overanalysis, of missing opportunities because I was afraid to take calculated risks. I accused him of being reckless, of prioritizing growth over stability, of not understanding the difference between opportunity and disaster. The conversation escalated until Dylan stormed out, saying he needed time to think about whether we shared the same vision for Zenith Flow's future. That night, I couldn't sleep. For the first time since starting the company, I questioned whether the partnership had been a mistake. Dylan brought undeniable value to Zenith Flow, but our fundamental disagreements about business strategy were becoming impossible to ignore. I found myself wondering if I'd created a situation where I'd eventually be forced to choose between family harmony and business survival. The following week, Dylan returned with what he called a compromise proposal. Instead of acquiring Desert Express outright, we would form a joint venture, taking a 60% stake in exchange for operational management and $200,000 in working capital. This structure would limit our exposure while giving us access to their client relationships and market presence. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The joint venture seemed like a way to test Dylan's theories about expansion, while maintaining some control over our risk exposure. Within 30 days, we'd completed the deal, and Dylan was spending 3 days a week in Las Vegas, implementing what he called the Zenith Flow transformation. Initially, his optimism seemed justified. Driver productivity improved immediately once we implemented our route optimization software. Customer complaints dropped as we introduced our quality control protocols. Revenue at the Las Vegas operation increased 15% in the first quarter under our management. But the underlying problems I'd identified in the financial analysis proved more persistent than Dylan anticipated. The improved metrics masked ongoing issues with vehicle maintenance, driver recruitment, and client payment patterns. By the 6th month, it became clear that the Las Vegas operation would require significantly more capital investment than we'd projected to achieve sustainable profitability. The stress of managing 2 operations across 2 states, combined with the financial pressure of the Las Vegas investment, began affecting other aspects of our business. I was working 16-hour days again, constantly traveling between Phoenix and Las Vegas, struggling to maintain the hands-on management style that had made Zenith Flow successful. Meanwhile, our core Phoenix operation started showing signs of strain as I devoted more attention to the struggling Las Vegas venture. Dylan, to his credit, worked tirelessly to make the Las Vegas operation successful. But his approach to problem-solving often involved spending money we didn't have on solutions that addressed symptoms rather than root causes. When driver retention remained problematic, he increased wages across the board rather than addressing the scheduling and route assignment issues that were actually causing turnover. When vehicle maintenance costs exceeded budget, he leased newer trucks rather than implementing the preventative maintenance protocols that would have reduced long-term expenses. Our monthly partnership meetings became exercises in damage control. I'd present financial reports showing declining margins and increased debt service, while Dylan would counter with operational metrics showing improved efficiency and customer satisfaction. We were looking at the same business through completely different lenses, and our interpretations of the data led to fundamentally incompatible conclusions about what needed to be done. The breaking point came during our December partnership meeting, exactly 2 years after Dylan had signed the original agreement. Zenith Flow's Phoenix operation remained profitable, but the Las Vegas venture had consumed $380,000 in additional capital beyond our initial investment. Our debt-to-equity ratio had risen to levels that made me uncomfortable, and our cash reserves were at their lowest point since the company's first year. "We need to cut our losses," I told Dylan, presenting a proposal to sell our stake in the Las Vegas operation back to Catherine Martinez. "The joint venture isn't working. We're throwing good money after bad, and it's starting to affect our core business." Dylan's reaction was more intense than I'd expected. "You're talking about giving up just when we're on the verge of turning it around. The December numbers are going to be strong. Holiday shipping always drives revenue. If we can just get through the first quarter, the operation will be cash flow positive." Dylan, we've been saying just one more quarter for 6 months. The fundamental problems haven't been solved, they've been masked by constant capital injections. This is exactly the kind of situation that destroys profitable companies. What Dylan said next changed everything between us. Maybe the problem isn't the Las Vegas operation. Maybe the problem is that you're so afraid of losing control that you can't see opportunities when they're right in front of you. This partnership was supposed to be about shared decision-making, but you still act like this is your personal kingdom. The accusations stung because it contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. I had been reluctant to delegate major decisions, especially ones involving significant financial risk. But I'd built Zenith Flow from nothing, sacrificed everything to make it successful, and I wasn't willing to gamble its future on Dylan's optimistic projections. "This is my kingdom," I replied, the words coming out harder than I'd intended. "I built this company before you showed any interest in working. The partnership agreement gives you a voice in major decisions, but it doesn't give you veto power over my judgment about what's best for the business." Dylan stood up slowly, his expression shifting from anger to something colder. "I see. So the partnership is real when you need my help with clients, but when it comes to actual business strategy, you're still the king making all the decisions. That's not fair, and you know it. We've had this conversation a dozen times. I value your input, but I won't risk everything we've built chasing growth for growth's sake." "Then maybe we need to reconsider this whole arrangement," Dylan said quietly, "because I can't work in a situation where I'm treated like an employee with a fancy title." He left my office that afternoon, and we didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally returned, his demeanor had changed fundamentally. He was polite but distant, professional but cold. He attended meetings, completed his responsibilities, and maintained relationships with clients. But the easy collaboration that had defined our partnership was gone. I told myself this was temporary, that Dylan needed time to process his disappointment about the Las Vegas decision. I focused on salvaging what we could from the joint venture, while trying to rebuild our cash reserves and restore stability to the Phoenix operation. But I failed to notice the subtle changes in Dylan's behavior that should have alarmed me. He began working longer hours, but often alone and after most employees had left for the day. He requested access to financial systems he'd never shown interest in before, claiming he wanted to better understand the business metrics I used for decision-making. He started having private conversations with key employees, ostensibly about their career development and satisfaction with the company culture. Most concerning, he began asking detailed questions about business continuity planning. What would happen if I were unable to work for an extended period? Who had backup access to critical systems? How were important contracts structured to handle management transitions? At the time, I interpreted these questions as Dylan's attempt to understand the business more thoroughly, perhaps to prove his capability for greater responsibility. I should have recognized them as reconnaissance for a plan that was already forming in his mind. A plan that would be triggered by an event neither of us could have anticipated, but that Dylan would be remarkably well prepared to exploit when the opportunity arose. The headaches started in February, subtle at first, just a dull pressure behind my eyes that I attributed to stress and too many hours staring at computer screens. I'd been pushing myself harder than usual, trying to stabilize our finances after the Las Vegas debacle, while maintaining our service standards in Phoenix. 18-hour workdays had become routine, and I was surviving on a diet of energy drinks, takeout food, and sheer determination. Dr. Amanda Richardson, my primary care physician, initially shared my assumption that the headaches were stress-related. "You're a classic case of executive burnout," she said during my annual physical in early March. "When's the last time you took a real vacation?" And I don't mean a long weekend checking emails from a hotel room. I couldn't remember. The last real break I'd taken was a 4-day trip to Sedona with Sarah, my girlfriend of 2 years. And even then I'd spent half the time on conference calls with clients. Sarah, a marketing director at a renewable energy company, had been increasingly vocal about my work-life balance, or lack thereof. "You're going to work yourself into an early grave," she'd warned during a rare dinner together the night before my doctor's appointment. "And for what? Dylan's already proven he can handle client relationships. You have competent managers. Why can't you delegate more?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah was echoing concerns that Dylan had raised repeatedly during our partnership disputes. But delegation meant relinquishing control. and recent events had only reinforced my belief that maintaining oversight was essential for protecting what I'd built. Dr. Richardson prescribed a mild muscle relaxant and recommended stress management techniques: meditation, regular exercise, better sleep hygiene. For a few weeks, the headaches seemed to improve. I even managed to take a weekend off, during which Sarah and I visited her parents in Tucson, and I successfully avoided checking email for 36 hours. But by April, the headaches had returned with increased intensity. They were accompanied by new symptoms: occasional dizziness, moments of confusion, and strange visual disturbances where I'd see flashing lights in my peripheral vision. I found myself struggling to concentrate during meetings, losing my train of thought mid-sentence, and experiencing what I can only describe as mental fog. Dylan noticed the changes before I was willing to acknowledge them. "You seem off lately," he observed during one of our increasingly strained weekly meetings. "Are you feeling all right? You've been repeating yourself, and yesterday you asked me about the Henderson contract 3 times in the same conversation." I dismissed his concerns, attributing my symptoms to fatigue and the pressure of managing our financial recovery. But privately, I was beginning to worry. The visual disturbances were becoming more frequent, and I'd started experiencing brief episodes where I'd find myself in a room with no memory of how I'd gotten there. During one particularly frightening incident, I came to awareness standing in our warehouse at 2 a.m., still wearing my pajamas, with no recollection of driving there. It was Sarah who finally forced me to seek additional medical attention. She found me one morning sitting at my kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. When she asked what I was thinking about, I couldn't answer because I genuinely didn't know. The previous 2 hours were simply gone from my memory. "This isn't stress," she said firmly, her voice carrying a fear I'd never heard before. "This is something medical, and you're seeing a neurologist today." Dr. Michael Torres was the kind of specialist whose calm professionalism immediately inspired confidence, while simultaneously terrifying you about why you needed his services. After a comprehensive examination that included cognitive tests, balance assessments, and neurological function evaluations, he ordered an immediate MRI. "I'm seeing some concerning indicators," he explained as we reviewed my test results. "The combination of progressive headaches, cognitive symptoms, and visual disturbances suggests we need to rule out several possibilities, including increased intracranial pressure." The MRI was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Dr. Torres emphasized that many conditions could explain my symptoms, and that jumping to conclusions would be premature. But his tone and the urgency with which he'd ordered the scan suggested he was worried about something specific that he wasn't ready to discuss. I should have told Dylan about the medical investigation immediately. As my business partner, he had a right to know if there were potential health issues that could affect company operations. But our relationship had been so strained since the Las Vegas dispute that I hesitated to show any vulnerability. I was afraid he might interpret my health problems as an opportunity to push for greater control over business decisions. Instead, I confided only in Sarah and my assistant, Elena Martinez, asking her to block out time for medical appointments without specifying their nature. Elena had been with Zenith Flow since our 2nd year of operation, and her discretion was absolute. If anyone could help me manage the situation quietly until we knew what we were dealing with, it was her. The MRI results came back on a Thursday afternoon in late April. Dr. Torres called personally, his voice carefully controlled but unable to hide the gravity of what he needed to discuss. "Marcus, I need you to come in immediately. We've found something that requires urgent attention." The something was a tumor. Specifically, a meningioma, a growth attached to the membrane surrounding my brain that was pressing against my frontal lobe and causing the symptoms I'd been experiencing. Dr. Torres explained that meningiomas were usually benign, but their location and size could make them life-threatening, regardless of their malignancy. "The good news is that this type of tumor is typically non-cancerous," he said, pointing to the MRI images on his computer screen. "The challenging news is that its position is causing significant pressure on brain tissue, and it's large enough that removal will require complex surgery." I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. The tumor appeared as a white mass about the size of a golf ball, clearly visible against the gray matter of my brain. It looked alien, invasive, like something that had no business being inside my skull. "How long has it been there?" I asked. Impossible to say definitively. Meningiomas typically grow slowly, so this could have been developing for months or even years. The recent acceleration of symptoms suggests it may have reached a critical size where further growth could be dangerous. Dr. Torres referred me to Dr. Patricia Waldman, a neurosurgeon at Banner Health with extensive experience in meningioma removal. Their earliest consultation appointment was the following Monday, but Dr. Torres made it clear that this was urgent. The surgery needed to happen within weeks, not months. That night, I sat in my living room with Sarah, both of us struggling to process the day's revelations. The business problems that had consumed my thoughts for months suddenly seemed trivial compared to the prospect of brain surgery. But even in the midst of my medical crisis, I couldn't stop thinking about zenith flow and what would happen if the surgery went badly. "You have to tell Dylan," Sarah said when I voiced these concerns. "Whatever problems you two have been having, he needs to know about this. The company needs a continuity plan." She was right, but the conversation filled me with dread. Dylan and I had barely been speaking beyond what was necessary for business operations. Our relationship had become purely transactional, professional but cold. Now I had to admit vulnerability, to acknowledge that I might not be able to maintain the control I'd fought so hard to preserve. I called Dylan the next morning and asked him to meet me at the office early, before other employees arrived. He seemed surprised by the request, but agreed to be there at 7 a.m. When he walked into my office and saw my expression, his demeanor immediately shifted from guarded professionalism to genuine concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "You look terrible." I explained everything. The months of symptoms I'd been hiding, the medical investigation, the MRI results, and the upcoming surgery consultation. Dylan listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How long?" he finally asked. "How long what?" "How long have you been dealing with this alone? The headaches, the confusion." "I noticed you've been struggling, but I thought it was just stress from the business conflicts." "Since February. Maybe longer, but that's when I first acknowledged something was wrong." Dylan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Jesus, Marcus. Why didn't you tell me sooner? We're partners, whatever problems we've been having about business strategy. This is bigger than all of that." For the first time in months, I saw the brother I remembered from our childhood in his expression. Not the ambitious business partner who'd been challenging my authority, but the older brother who'd looked out for me when we were kids. It was simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking. "I was afraid," I admitted. "Afraid of looking weak. Afraid you'd use it against me in our disagreements about the company direction. I know that sounds paranoid, but things have been so tense between us." "That's on both of us," Dylan said quietly. "But Marcus, if something happens to you during surgery, if there are complications, the company needs to be prepared. You need to be prepared." We spent the next 4 hours developing what we called a medical emergency protocol. Dylan would assume temporary operational control if I was incapacitated for more than 48 hours. Elena would have power of attorney for routine business decisions. Our lawyers would draft documentation ensuring continuity of client relationships and vendor agreements. At Dylan's suggestion, we also updated my will and beneficiary designations. It felt morbid, but he argued convincingly that hoping for the best while preparing for the worst was simply responsible business practice. Given his recent focus on business continuity planning, his thoroughness in addressing these details seemed natural. The surgery consultation with Dr. Waldman was both reassuring and terrifying. She explained that meningioma removal was a routine procedure for neurosurgeons, with success rates exceeding 95% for tumors in my position. However, the surgery would require opening my skull, working near critical brain tissue, and keeping me under anesthesia for potentially 6 to 8 hours. "The risks are minimal but real," she explained. "Infection, bleeding, damage to surrounding brain tissue, complications from anesthesia. In rare cases, patients experience personality changes or cognitive impairment. But the alternative, Leaving the tumor in place virtually guarantees progressive neurological deterioration. The surgery was scheduled for May 15th, 3 weeks away. Dr. Waldman recommended that I arrange for at least 2 weeks of recovery time, during which I'd need complete rest, and should avoid any stressful decision-making. For someone who'd been controlling every aspect of his business for 5 years, the prospect of being completely disconnected for 2 weeks felt almost as frightening as the surgery itself. Dylan threw himself into preparation with an intensity that both impressed and slightly unnerved me. He met with every department head, reviewed all active contracts, and created detailed status reports on every aspect of our operations. He even arranged for daily video calls during my recovery so I could stay informed without the stress of active management. "You need to focus entirely on getting better," he insisted when I suggested a more limited communication schedule. "I can handle everything for 2 weeks. That's what partners are for." In the days leading up to surgery, our relationship seemed to heal remarkably quickly. The crisis had stripped away the petty conflicts and power struggles that had dominated our interactions for months. We were brothers again, facing a scary situation together, with Dylan stepping up to support me in ways that reminded me why I'd wanted him as a partner in the first place. The night before surgery, Dylan came to my house with takeout from our favorite Mexican restaurant and a bottle of expensive tequila. We sat on my patio, eating carnitas tacos and talking about everything except the surgery. Childhood memories, family stories, dreams for Zenith Flow's future once I recovered. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Dylan said as we finished the bottle, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you built. I know I've been pushing for changes, maybe pushing too hard, but what you created with Zenith Flow is incredible. Dad would be amazed." It was the closest thing to an apology either of us had managed since our conflicts began, and it meant more to me than I could express. As I fell asleep that night, I felt genuinely optimistic about both my surgery and our renewed partnership. I had no idea that while I was preparing to trust Dylan with my life's work, he was already implementing plans that would make my medical crisis the perfect cover for the most devastating betrayal of my life. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia took hold was Dr. Waldman's calm voice explaining that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The surgery, she estimated, would take approximately 7 hours, and I'd wake up in the ICU for monitoring before being transferred to a regular room. Sarah squeezed my hand, and Dylan gave me what I thought was an encouraging smile. Then the world faded to black. What I didn't know was that Dylan had been waiting for this moment for months. While I lay unconscious on an operating table, Dylan was implementing a plan so methodical and comprehensive that it could only have been conceived by someone with intimate knowledge of our business operations and legal vulnerabilities. Every question he'd asked about business continuity, every late-night session in the office, every request for system access had been reconnaissance for this moment. The surgery itself was successful. Dr. Waldman later told me that the tumor had been completely removed without complications, and initial tests confirmed it was benign. But while surgeons were carefully extracting the mass from my brain, Dylan was surgically removing me from my own company with equal precision. His first move came just 4 hours into my surgery, while I was still on the operating table. Dylan called an emergency meeting of Zenith Flow's board of directors, a 3-person board consisting of myself, Dylan, and Janet Rodriguez, our company attorney who also served as an independent director. Dylan informed Janet that I had suffered a massive stroke during surgery and was in critical condition with an uncertain prognosis. "The doctors aren't sure if he'll survive," Dylan told Janet, his voice carefully modulated to convey appropriate grief and concern. "And if he does, they're saying there could be significant brain damage. We need to act quickly to protect the company and our employees." Janet, who had worked with us for 3 years and genuinely cared about both brothers, was devastated by the news. She had no reason to doubt Dylan's account, especially since he could accurately describe the hospital, the surgical team, and the general timeline of the procedure. His inside knowledge of my condition made his lies completely credible. "What do you need from me?" Janet asked, her legal training overriding her emotional response to focus on practical necessities. Dylan presented documents he claimed to have prepared in consultation with the hospital's social services department. These papers would transfer temporary control of Zenith Flow to him as the surviving partner, ensuring continuity of operations while my condition remained uncertain. Janet, operating under the belief that I was dying or permanently incapacitated, signed the necessary authorizations without the careful review she would normally conduct. But Dylan's deception went far beyond exploiting Janet's emotional state. Over the previous months, he had been secretly documenting what he characterized as evidence of my mental instability and erratic decision-making. He had recorded conversations where I expressed frustration about business challenges, saved emails where I discussed feeling overwhelmed, and compiled reports from employees who had mentioned my recent confusion and memory lapses. Presented in the right context, this collection of evidence painted a picture of a business owner suffering from psychological breakdown, someone who had become a liability to his own company. Dylan used this documentation to support his narrative that my hospitalization was not just a medical emergency, but the culmination of months of declining mental health that had been affecting my judgment and leadership capability. While Janet processed the paperwork for emergency operational control, Dylan was simultaneously executing Phase 2 of his plan. He contacted our 3 largest clients, Cloud Commerce, Southwest Retail Solutions, and Desert Mountain Logistics, informing them that I had suffered a catastrophic health event and would be unable to continue managing their accounts. I want to assure you that Zenith Flow's service standards will not be affected, Dylan told each client. Marcus had been struggling with health issues for months, and frankly, some of his recent decisions had been concerning. With him out of the picture, we can focus on what we do best, delivering exceptional logistics services without the distraction of erratic leadership. The conversations were masterfully crafted. Dylan expressed appropriate concern for my well-being, while subtly undermining confidence in my leadership and positioning himself as the stable, reliable alternative. He offered each client expanded service packages at reduced rates, framing these concessions as his way of ensuring continuity during the transition. Cloud Commerce, our largest client representing 40% of our revenue, was particularly receptive to Dylan's overtures. Their procurement director, Kevin Walsh, had always preferred working with Dylan over me, finding him more flexible and easier to negotiate with. When Dylan suggested that my absence might be an opportunity to modernize our service agreement with better terms and faster expansion into new markets, Kevin was immediately interested. Honestly, Kevin told Dylan during their emergency meeting, Marcus always seemed wound too tight. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise for everyone. By the end of my first day in surgery, Dylan had secured verbal agreements from all 3 major clients to expanded contracts under his leadership. More importantly, he had positioned my absence not as a temporary medical leave, but as a permanent transition away from erratic leadership that had been holding the company back. Phase 3 involved our employees, and here Dylan's natural charisma proved devastatingly effective. He called an all-hands meeting for the morning after my surgery, ostensibly to address concerns about my condition and reassure everyone about job security. But the subtext of his message was clear. Marcus had been struggling for months. His health problems explained his recent poor decisions, and Zenith Flow would be more stable and successful under new leadership. I know many of you have noticed that Marcus hasn't been himself lately, Dylan told the assembled staff. The confusion, the memory lapses, the sudden changes in direction. We now understand these were symptoms of a serious medical condition that affected his judgment. Moving forward, I want you to know that we're going to operate with clearer communication, more consistent policies, and a leadership team that's fully present and engaged. Several employees nodded in recognition. My recent symptoms had been noticeable, and Dylan's explanation provided a framework for understanding behavior that had confused and concerned them. Rather than feeling like they were betraying their boss, employees felt like they were finally getting answers about changes they had witnessed but hadn't understood. Elena Martinez, my assistant, was the only employee who expressed skepticism about Dylan's version of events. She had been with the company longer than anyone except me, and she understood my management style and decision-making patterns better than most. When Dylan suggested that my recent behavior had been erratic and concerning, Elena pushed back. Marcus has been under a lot of stress, but his decisions have been consistent with his approach to business, she said during the staff meeting. He's always been cautious about expansion and careful about financial management. That's not erratic. That's his leadership style. Dylan's response was swift and decisive. He thanked Elena for her loyalty to me but suggested that her close working relationship might have prevented her from recognizing the warning signs that were obvious to others. Within 24 hours, Elena found herself reassigned to a reduced role with limited access to executive-level information. Dylan explained this change as necessary for maintaining appropriate boundaries during the leadership transition. The fourth phase of Dylan's plan was perhaps the most insidious: the systematic revision of company records and documentation. With access to all corporate systems and no oversight, Dylan began modifying historical documents to support his narrative about my declining mental state and poor business judgment. Email threads where I had expressed reasonable concerns about the Las Vegas expansion were edited to make my opposition seem irrational and inflexible. Financial projections I had created were modified to appear overly pessimistic and unrealistic. Meeting minutes were altered to suggest that my contributions had been confused or contradictory. Dylan also created new documentation purporting to show that he had been carrying an increasing burden of operational responsibility as my health declined. According to these revised records, most successful business initiatives over the past 6 months had been his ideas, while problematic decisions were attributed to my deteriorating judgment. Most critically, Dylan prepared documentation suggesting that I had been considering stepping down from active management due to my health concerns. He created backdated emails discussing succession planning and even forged my signature on documents outlining a voluntary transition of leadership responsibilities. By the third day of my hospitalization, while I was still sedated and recovering from surgery, Dylan had effectively erased me from my own company. The business I had built from nothing, the relationships I had cultivated over 5 years, the systems and processes I had developed, all of it was being rebranded as Dylan's creation, with my role minimized to that of a struggling founder who had been holding back progress. But Dylan's most brilliant move was how he handled the legal and financial aspects of the takeover. Rather than attempting to bypass the partnership agreement entirely, he exploited specific clauses that I had included as safeguards against exactly this type of situation. The partnership agreement contained provisions for involuntary dissolution of a partner's rights in cases of mental incapacity, criminal conviction, or actions detrimental to the company's interests. These clauses were designed to protect the business if one partner became unable or unwilling to fulfill their responsibilities. Dylan used fabricated evidence of my mental decline to trigger these provisions, arguing that my recent behavior constituted incapacity under the terms of our agreement. He also invoked the company's succession planning documents, which granted him temporary control in cases of my inability to manage operations. By extending the definition of inability to include not just physical incapacitation, but also mental unfitness, Dylan transformed a temporary medical leave into permanent leadership transition. The most devastating aspect of Dylan's plan was how he used my own safeguards against me. Every protection I had built into our partnership agreement, every contingency plan I had created for business continuity, became a weapon in his arsenal. My caution and preparation, qualities that had made Zenith Flow successful, were turned into the very mechanisms of my destruction. When I finally began to regain consciousness on day 4, groggy from anesthesia and pain medication, I had no idea that I was waking up to a world where my life's work had been systematically stolen by the person I trusted most. Dylan sat beside my hospital bed, holding my hand and expressing relief that I was going to be okay. "Don't worry about anything," he said softly when I tried to ask about the company. "I've been taking care of everything. Zenith Flow is in good hands. You just focus on getting better." His smile was warm and reassuring, exactly what a concerned brother should display. I had no reason to suspect that behind that facade of familial love lay the most calculated betrayal I could have imagined. Dylan had spent 4 days methodically dismantling my entire professional life, and he was doing it with such skill that I wouldn't even realize what had happened until it was far too late to stop him. The tumor was gone from my brain, but a far more dangerous cancer had metastasized through my business. And unlike the meningioma, this malignancy was malicious, calculating, and wearing the face of someone I loved. Recovery from brain surgery is a peculiar form of hell that no one prepares you for. The physical pain was manageable with medication, but the cognitive effects were disorienting and frightening. Simple tasks like reading a menu or following a television show required intense concentration. My short-term memory was fractured, I'd have conversations that I couldn't remember 10 minutes later, and familiar faces sometimes seemed like strangers. Dr. Waldman assured me these symptoms were normal and temporary. Your brain is healing from significant trauma, she explained during my daily neurological assessments. The confusion and memory issues should resolve over the next few weeks as the swelling subsides and neural pathways reestablish themselves. But the cognitive fog made it impossible for me to process the subtle signs that should have alerted me to what Dylan was doing. When he visited twice daily with updates about zenith flow, I accepted his reports without question. My reduced mental capacity made his explanations seem reasonable, even when they contradicted my memories of how things had been before surgery. Cloud Commerce decided to expand their contract while you're recovering, Dylan explained during one visit, his tone carefully casual. Kevin Walsh felt it was a good time to renegotiate terms since we're temporarily operating with different leadership. I managed to secure a 30% increase in volume, though we had to reduce our per-delivery rate to make it work. In my weakened state, this sounded like positive news. Only later would I realize that Dylan had essentially given away our profit margins to lock in clients under his leadership, making it financially impossible for me to reclaim control, even if I discovered his deception. Sarah visited every day, bringing books, flowers, and increasingly concerning reports about how people were responding to news of my condition. It's strange, she said during my second week of recovery. Everyone keeps asking me about your long-term health issues and whether you'll be able to return to work. I keep telling them it was just a tumor removal and you're expected to make a full recovery, but they seem to have gotten different information. I was too medicated and disoriented to recognize the significance of her observation. The narrative Dylan had created about my declining mental health was spreading through our professional network, and my inability to contradict it in real time was allowing his version of events to become accepted reality. Elena Martinez tried to warn me, but her attempts were subtle and easily dismissed in my confused state. Mr. Chen, she said during one of her brief visits, some things at the office have been different since your surgery. I think you should know that. Dylan interrupted before she could finish. Elena's been having trouble adjusting to the temporary management structure, he explained to me later. She's very loyal to you, which is admirable, but it's making the transition challenging for everyone. I might need to consider reassigning her to reduce confusion. In my medicated haze, this seemed like a reasonable personnel decision. I couldn't understand why Elena looked so frustrated and hurt when I nodded my agreement. The first real alarm bell came from an unexpected source. Dr. Torres, the neurologist who had initially diagnosed my tumor. He stopped by during my second week of recovery to check on my progress, and casually mentioned a conversation he'd had with someone claiming to be my business partner. Your brother called yesterday asking about your long-term prognosis, Dr. Torres said while reviewing my chart. He seemed particularly concerned about whether the surgery might have affected your decision-making capacity or business judgment. I assured him that meningioma removal typically doesn't cause those kinds of cognitive changes, especially in cases like yours where the tumor wasn't pressing on executive function areas. Something about this conversation felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify why. What exactly did he ask? Specific questions about whether you might have ongoing memory problems, difficulty with complex reasoning, personality changes. He mentioned that your family was concerned about your ability to manage financial responsibilities. Dr. Torres paused, studying my expression. These seemed like unusual questions for someone whose brother had just had successful surgery. That night, alone in my hospital room, I tried to piece together the fragments of information that had been troubling me. Dylan's daily reports about business operations had been consistently positive, but they lacked the detailed financial analysis I would normally expect. Sarah's comments about people asking about my long-term health issues suggested a narrative I hadn't authorized. Elena's frustrated attempts to tell me something important. And now Dr. Torres reporting that Dylan had been inquiring about permanent cognitive damage. I requested my phone and attempted to access Zenith Flow's financial systems remotely. The login credentials that had worked for years were suddenly invalid. When I called our IT support, I was told that access had been temporarily suspended for security reasons during the medical emergency. Who authorized that? I asked. Mr. Dylan Chen, as acting CEO, came the response. He said all external access should be restricted until you're fully recovered. Acting CEO. The title hit me like a physical blow. I had never authorized Dylan to use that title, and it suggested a level of authority transfer that went far beyond the temporary operational control we had discussed. I called Janet Rodriguez, our company attorney, but her phone went straight to voicemail. When I tried her office number, her assistant said she was in meetings all week and couldn't take calls. This was highly unusual. Janet had always been immediately available when I needed legal guidance. Growing increasingly anxious, I called our bank to check on Zenith Flow's accounts. After navigating through security verification, I was told that account access had been restricted and that all inquiries needed to go through the authorized signatory, Dylan Chen. "I'm the company owner," I said, my voice rising with frustration. "I need information about my own business accounts." "I understand, sir, but we received documentation indicating that you're currently incapacitated and that Mr. Dylan Chen has power of attorney for all business matters. I'd need to see updated legal documentation before I could provide account information directly to you." Power of attorney. We had discussed emergency authorizations before my surgery, but the scope of what Dylan had apparently implemented went far beyond what I had agreed to. I hung up the phone with shaking hands, my post-surgical headache intensifying as the reality of my situation began to crystallize. That evening, I called Dylan and asked him to come to the hospital immediately. When he arrived, looking concerned and carrying my favorite coffee from a local cafe, I confronted him about what I'd discovered. "Why am I locked out of the company systems?" I asked without preamble. Dylan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. A brief flash of calculation before his concerned brother mask slipped back into place. "The doctors recommended limiting stress during your recovery. I thought it would be better if you didn't worry about day-to-day operations until you're fully healed." "That's not your decision to make. I want access restored immediately." "Marcus, you're still recovering from brain surgery. Your judgment might not be completely reliable right now. I'm just trying to protect you and the business." The condescending tone triggered something deep in my memory. This was how Dylan had spoken to me during our worst arguments about business strategy. Not like a concerned brother, but like someone who believed I was incompetent and needed his guidance. "Protect me from what? It's my company." "Actually," Dylan said quietly, "it's our company. And right now, with your health situation, I'm the only partner capable of making decisions. The medical documentation shows that your cognitive function has been compromised for months." "What medical documentation?" "I had a tumor removed. Dr. Waldman said my recovery is progressing perfectly." Dylan reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. "These are assessments from Dr. Torres, documenting your confusion and memory problems over the past 6 months. Combined with the psychological evaluation conducted after your surgery, they paint a clear picture of someone who shouldn't be making major business decisions." I snatched the folder and began reading. The documents purported to show a pattern of cognitive decline stretching back months before my surgery. But as I read, I realized that normal stress responses and the temporary confusion caused by the growing tumor had been recontextualized as evidence of mental incompetence. "This is bullshit," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You've taken isolated incidents and twisted them to make me look unstable." "I haven't twisted anything. I've documented reality. Marcus, you've been struggling for months. Everyone has noticed. The memory lapses, the confusion, the erratic decision-making. It's all been affecting the business." "What erratic decision-making? Being cautious about the Las Vegas expansion? Wanting to maintain financial stability?" "That's not erratic. That's responsible management." Dylan leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Responsible management doesn't involve berating employees for minor mistakes, forgetting client conversations, or changing strategic direction from week to week. You've become a liability to your own company." The accusation was so far from my self-perception that it left me speechless. Yes, I had been under stress. Yes, the tumor had been affecting my memory and concentration. But a liability? Someone who needed to be removed from their own business? "Even if any of that were true," I finally managed, "you don't have the authority to lock me out of my own company." The partnership agreement. The partnership agreement has provisions for exactly this situation, Dylan interrupted. Mental incapacity that affects business operations. I've followed every legal requirement for protecting the company's interests. He produced another document from his briefcase, a copy of our partnership agreement with specific sections highlighted. As I read, my blood turned to ice. The safeguards I had built into the contract to protect against a partner's incompetence were being used against me, with Dylan's fabricated evidence of my mental decline as justification. You planned this, I whispered, the full scope of his betrayal finally becoming clear. All those questions about business continuity, the access requests, the late nights in the office. You were preparing to steal my company. Dylan's mask finally dropped completely. The concerned brother disappeared, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. I didn't steal anything, he said quietly. I saved a business that was being destroyed by an owner who could no longer function effectively. Zenith Flow is thriving under proper leadership. Our clients are happy, our employees are more productive, and our financial performance has improved significantly. Because you gave away our profit margins to lock in contracts. I made strategic decisions that prioritized growth over your obsessive penny pinching. In 2 weeks, I've accomplished more than you managed in 6 months of cautious hesitation. The room seemed to spin around me as the magnitude of Dylan's betrayal sank in. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a temporary power grab. It was a calculated campaign to steal my life's work using my own legal protections against me. The clients, the employees, the board, they all believe you're mentally incompetent. Dylan continued, his voice matter of fact. Even if you somehow manage to challenge this legally, which you can't afford to do without access to company funds, who would believe you? A man who just had brain surgery claiming that his devoted brother stole his business. It sounds like exactly the kind of paranoid delusion that someone with your documented mental health issues might develop. Dylan stood to leave, adjusting his suit jacket with the casual confidence of someone who had just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. I'm sorry it had to be this way, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. But Zenith Flow was too important to let your deteriorating condition destroy it. Consider this a medical retirement. You'll have time to focus on your health without the stress of running a business you were no longer capable of managing. After he left, I sat alone in my hospital room, staring at the documents that had been used to justify stealing my company. Every safeguard I had created to protect Zenith Flow had been turned into a weapon against me. My brother, the person I had trusted most in the world, had spent months preparing to destroy me at my most vulnerable moment. But Dylan had made one critical mistake in his meticulous planning. In his eagerness to lock down every aspect of the company transfer, he had overlooked a detail that would prove to be his downfall. A detail buried so deep in our partnership agreement that even I had forgotten about it until this moment of desperate revelation. The detail that Dylan had overlooked was buried in Section 47C of our partnership agreement, a clause so obscure that even our attorney Janet Rodriguez had questioned its necessity when I insisted on including it. The provision dealt with extraordinary circumstances requiring independent verification, and it mandated that any partnership dissolution based on medical incapacity required confirmation from 3 independent medical professionals, not just documentation from treating physicians. More importantly, this clause specified that if any partner was found to have falsified medical evidence or manipulated the incapacity determination process, all transferred assets and authority would immediately revert to the original owner, along with punitive damages equal to 200% of any financial losses incurred during the unauthorized transfer period. I had included this provision because of a cautionary tale my business law professor had shared about a partnership where one partner had bribed a doctor to declare his business partner mentally incompetent. The story had seemed far-fetched at the time, but it illustrated how medical emergencies could be exploited for financial gain. Dylan's arrogance and his assumption that I wouldn't remember every detail of our legal agreements would prove to be his fatal mistake. But knowing about the clause and being able to act on it were entirely different challenges. I was still recovering from brain surgery, locked out of all company resources, and facing Dylan's carefully constructed narrative about my mental instability. I needed allies, evidence, and a strategy that could overcome the significant head start Dylan had secured through his deception. My first call was to Thomas Anderson, a former colleague from my FedEx days who had started his own legal practice specializing in corporate disputes. Tom had always been someone I trusted, and his law firm was completely independent of any connections to Zenith Flow or Dylan. "Marcus, I heard about your surgery. How are you feeling?" Tom's genuine concern was exactly what I needed after Dylan's calculated coldness. "Better physically, but I have a serious problem. I think my business partner has used my medical leave to steal my company." I explained the situation in detail, sending Tom photos of the documents Dylan had shown me, along with my own copies of the original partnership agreement. Tom's expertise in corporate law made him immediately grasp the legal implications of what Dylan had done. "This is sophisticated fraud," Tom said after reviewing everything. "Dylan has exploited legitimate medical documentation and used procedural technicalities to create an appearance of legal authority. But if we can prove he falsified or manipulated any of the medical evidence, the partnership agreement's extraordinary circumstances clause gives us grounds for complete reversal." How do we prove falsification? Dylan was careful to use real medical events and just recontextualize them. We start with the medical professionals. Dr. Torres documented your pre-surgical symptoms, but did he ever conclude that you were mentally incompetent? Did any doctor actually recommend that you be removed from business operations? This was the opening I needed. I called Dr. Torres and explained what Dylan had told people about my condition. Dr. Torres was immediately alarmed. "I never suggested you were mentally incompetent or unfit for business responsibilities," he said firmly. "Yes, you had cognitive symptoms from the tumor, but those were temporary and directly related to the physical pressure on your brain tissue. Brain tumors don't affect business judgment or decision-making capacity unless they're in very specific locations, which yours wasn't." More importantly, Dr. Torres revealed that Dylan had contacted him multiple times asking leading questions designed to elicit responses that could be taken out of context. He kept asking whether cognitive symptoms might affect your ability to make sound financial decisions, whether personality changes were possible, whether the surgery might have lasting effects on executive function. I gave him factual medical information, but I never concluded that you were incapacitated or incompetent. Tom immediately arranged for Dr. Torres to provide a sworn affidavit clarifying the medical facts and documenting Dylan's attempts to manipulate his professional opinions. We also contacted Dr. Waldman, who was equally willing to provide testimony that my surgical recovery had been completely normal and that there was no medical basis for considering me mentally incapacitated. But medical evidence was only part of the puzzle. We needed to document the financial and operational damage Dylan had caused during his unauthorized control of the company. This required getting inside information from Zenith Flow employees who might be willing to speak truthfully about what had happened. Elena Martinez was our obvious first contact. When Tom called her as my legal representative, she was initially hesitant to speak, concerned about her job security under Dylan's management. But when Tom explained the legal protections for whistleblowers and the evidence we were gathering about Dylan's fraud, she agreed to meet secretly. Elena's information was devastating to Dylan's position. She had been keeping detailed records of all the changes Dylan had implemented, concerned that his actions went far beyond what any reasonable temporary authority would justify. "He's been operating like he owns the company," she told us during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop across town. "New contracts, personnel changes, policy revisions, everything has been positioned as permanent rather than temporary. He told the staff that Marcus might never return to work and that they should consider him the permanent CEO. More damaging was Elena's documentation of Dylan's financial decisions. The contract concessions he had made to lock in clients weren't just temporary price reductions. They were multi-year agreements that would cost Zenith Flow hundreds of thousands in lost revenue. Dylan had also authorized salary increases for key employees, positioning these as retention bonuses, but structuring them as permanent compensation changes that couldn't be easily reversed. "It's like he was spending Marcus's money to buy loyalty and lock in his position," Elena explained. Every decision was designed to make it harder for Marcus to resume control, even if he recovered completely. Elena also revealed that Dylan had been having private conversations with our largest clients, suggesting that my health problems were more serious than publicly disclosed, and that Zenith Flow would be more reliable under his permanent leadership. These conversations constituted interference with business relationships and potentially fraudulent misrepresentation of my condition. But the most explosive information Elena provided concerned Dylan's interaction with our board of directors. She had overheard his phone conversation with Janet Rodriguez and could testify that Dylan had lied about the severity of my condition, claiming I had suffered a stroke and might have permanent brain damage. He practiced that conversation, Elena said. I heard him rehearsing it in his office the night before Marcus's surgery, getting the emotional tone right, making sure he sounded appropriately devastated, while still conveying the business urgency. This revelation was the smoking gun we needed. Dylan hadn't just exploited a medical emergency. He had planned and rehearsed his deception in advance, proving premeditation and fraudulent intent. Tom immediately contacted Janet Rodriguez to inform her about Dylan's deception. Janet's reaction was swift and furious. As our corporate attorney, she had been manipulated into authorizing Dylan's authority based on completely false information about my condition. Dylan told me you'd had a massive stroke and were in a coma with uncertain chances of survival, Janet said when she called me directly. He presented hospital documentation and spoke with such specific knowledge about your condition that I had no reason to doubt him. I would never have authorized those transfers if I'd known the truth. Janet's fury at being manipulated made her a powerful ally. She immediately began preparing documentation to reverse all the authorizations she had granted based on Dylan's false information. She also confirmed that Dylan's actions went far beyond what any reasonable interpretation of the partnership agreement would allow, even in cases of genuine medical incapacity. While we were gathering evidence, Dylan continued operating Zenith Flow as if his position was secure. His confidence was understandable. From his perspective, he had executed a perfect theft. I was discredited, locked out of all systems, and facing an uphill battle to prove that my own brother had systematically stolen my company while I was unconscious. But Dylan's assumption that I would be too weakened and isolated to mount an effective response was about to prove catastrophically wrong. Tom had been working with Elena to document every action Dylan had taken since my surgery, building a comprehensive case that would demonstrate both the extent of his unauthorized control and the fraudulent basis for his authority. 3 weeks after my surgery, exactly when Dr. Waldman had cleared me to resume normal activities, Tom filed an emergency motion with the Superior Court of Arizona, requesting immediate restoration of my control over Zenith Flow logistics. The motion included sworn affidavits from both Dr. Torres and Dr. Waldman confirming that I had never been mentally incapacitated, documentation of Dylan's deceptive statements to our board and clients, financial records showing the damage caused by his unauthorized decisions, and Elena's testimony about Dylan's premeditated deception. The legal filing also triggered the extraordinary circumstances clause in our partnership agreement, which meant that if we could prove Dylan had falsified or manipulated medical evidence, which we clearly could, all his actions would be retroactively invalidated, and he would face punitive damages. Dylan received notice of the legal action while he was conducting a meeting with potential new clients, positioning Zenith Flow for expansion into the California market. According to Elena, who was present during the meeting, Dylan's confident demeanor evaporated when the process server handed him the court documents. The motion requested emergency relief, meaning a hearing would be scheduled within 72 hours. Dylan would have less than 3 days to respond to detailed allegations of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate theft. More importantly, he would have to do so without access to company funds, since the motion included a request for asset freezing pending resolution of the dispute. That evening, Dylan called me for the first time since our confrontation in the hospital. His tone was no longer coldly confident. There was an edge of panic that he was trying to suppress. "Marcus, we need to talk. This legal action is unnecessary. We can work something out between family members without involving the courts." "There's nothing to work out," I replied. "You stole my company based on lies about my medical condition. The only conversation we're going to have is in front of a judge." "You're making a mistake. Even if you win in court, the damage to Zenith Flow's reputation will be significant. Clients don't want to work with companies involved in messy legal disputes between partners. This was Dylan's first attempt at what would become an increasingly desperate series of negotiations and threats. He was finally beginning to understand that his carefully constructed theft was unraveling, and that the legal protections I had built into our partnership agreement were about to destroy him as thoroughly as he had tried to destroy me. But Dylan still didn't realize how completely I had documented his deception, or how devastating the evidence against him would prove in court. His final mistake was about to be underestimating the very same attention to detail and preparation that had built Zenith Flow in the first place. The emergency hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in Judge Patricia Sullivan's courtroom. Judge Sullivan was known throughout the Arizona legal community for her meticulous attention to detail and complete intolerance for procedural games or courtroom theatrics. If we could present our evidence clearly and convincingly, she would rule based on facts rather than emotional appeals. Dylan arrived at the courthouse with a 3-person legal team from Morrison & Associates, one of Phoenix's most expensive corporate law firms. Their presence suggested he was taking the threat seriously, but it also indicated he was burning through Zenith Flow's cash reserves to pay for his defense, another unauthorized expenditure that would add to his eventual liability. I sat with Tom Anderson and Elena Martinez, who would be testifying about Dylan's deceptive practices and unauthorized decisions. We had prepared meticulously, organizing our evidence into a clear narrative that would demonstrate both the fraudulent basis for Dylan's authority and the extensive damage he had caused during his unauthorized control. Judge Sullivan called the hearing to order at 9 a.m. sharp. Tom began our presentation with a timeline of events, starting with my legitimate medical emergency and quickly moving to Dylan's systematic deception about my condition and prognosis. Your Honor, this case involves a calculated theft disguised as emergency business management, Tom stated in his opening remarks. While Marcus Chen was unconscious and recovering from successful brain surgery, his brother Dylan Chen implemented a premeditated plan to steal control of their company, using fabricated evidence of mental incapacity. Dylan's lead attorney, Rebecca Morrison, attempted to frame our action as a disgruntled business partner trying to undo legitimate emergency measures. Mr. Dylan Chen acted responsibly to protect a valuable business during his brother's medical crisis, she argued. The accusations of fraud are unfounded attempts to reverse proper corporate governance during an owner's incapacitation. But Morrison's argument began to crumble when Tom presented our medical evidence. Dr. Torres testified via video conference, explaining in clear, professional terms that he had never diagnosed me as mentally incompetent or recommended my removal from business responsibilities. Mr. Dylan Chen repeatedly contacted me asking leading questions about potential cognitive effects of brain tumors, Dr. Torres testified. When I provided general medical information, he seemed to be looking for statements he could interpret as evidence of incompetence. At no time did I suggest that Marcus Chen was unfit to manage business operations. Dr. Waldman's testimony was even more damaging to Dylan's position. She confirmed that meningioma removal rarely causes the kind of executive dysfunction Dylan had claimed, and that my post-surgical recovery had been completely normal. Based on the surgical location and Mr. Chen's post-operative progress, there was never any medical basis for considering him mentally incapacitated, Dr. Waldman stated. His cognitive symptoms were temporary effects of tumor pressure that resolved completely after removal. Elena Martinez's testimony provided the courtroom with a detailed account of Dylan's deception and unauthorized actions. Her meticulous record-keeping painted a clear picture of someone who had been planning to steal the company rather than temporarily managing it during a medical emergency. Mr. Dylan Chen told employees that his brother might never return to work, Elena testified. He made permanent changes to contracts, personnel policies, and financial arrangements. He acted like someone who expected to control the company indefinitely, not someone managing a temporary emergency. The most devastating moment came when Elena described overhearing Dylan rehearsing his phone call to Janet Rodriguez about my supposed stroke. The premeditation this revealed transformed Dylan's actions from opportunistic exploitation to calculated fraud. Morrison attempted to discredit Elena's testimony by suggesting she was a disgruntled employee with divided loyalties, but Judge Sullivan quickly shut down this line of questioning. Elena's documentation was too thorough and her testimony too specific to be dismissed as bias or vindictiveness. When Dylan finally took the stand in his own defense, his carefully constructed narrative began to unravel under Tom's cross-examination. Tom methodically walked Dylan through each false statement he had made to medical professionals, board members, employees, and clients. "Mr. Chen, did you tell Janet Rodriguez that your brother had suffered a massive stroke? I may have misunderstood the medical terminology. Did you tell her he was in a coma with uncertain chances of survival? The situation was very stressful, and I was trying to convey the seriousness. Did you tell Cloud Commerce that your brother's health problems were more serious than publicly disclosed?" Dylan's responses became increasingly evasive as Tom forced him to confront the systematic nature of his deception. Each lie was documented, each manipulation was exposed, and the pattern of calculated fraud became undeniable. The financial evidence was equally damaging. Tom presented detailed analysis showing that Dylan's contract concessions had cost Zenith Flow over $400,000 in projected revenue, while his unauthorized salary increases had committed the company to an additional $180,000 in annual expenses. These weren't temporary emergency measures. They were permanent structural changes that benefited Dylan's position while damaging the company's financial health. Morrison's defense strategy collapsed entirely when Tom introduced evidence of Dylan's communication with potential investors about acquiring his mentally incapacitated brother's share of the company. Dylan had been actively shopping my partnership stake to outside buyers, planning to sell my life's work to strangers while I recovered from surgery. Judge Sullivan's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. When Morrison attempted to argue that Dylan's actions were justified by genuine concerns about my mental health, the judge interrupted. "Counselor, the medical evidence presented today clearly establishes that Mr. Marcus Chen was never mentally incapacitated. Your client's justification for his actions is based on a medical condition that demonstrably did not exist. How do you explain that discrepancy?" Morrison had no effective response. The medical facts were unambiguous, and Dylan's deception was thoroughly documented. Judge Sullivan announced her decision after a brief recess. Her ruling was swift, comprehensive, and devastating to Dylan. "The evidence presented today establishes clear and convincing proof of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and unauthorized corporate control," she began. "Mr. Dylan Chen systematically deceived medical professionals, legal counsel, board members, and business partners about his brother's medical condition in order to steal control of their company. The judge ordered immediate restoration of my full authority over Zenith Flow, nullification of all contracts and agreements Dylan had executed during his unauthorized control, and activation of the partnership agreement's extraordinary circumstances clause. The court finds that Mr. Dylan Chen's actions constitute the most egregious violation of partnership duties imaginable, using a family member's medical emergency as cover for systematic theft," Judge Sullivan continued. "The punitive damage provision in their partnership agreement is not only warranted but essential to deter similar conduct." Dylan's face drained of color as the judge calculated his liability. The partnership agreement's 200% punitive damage clause meant he owed not just the direct financial losses he had caused, but twice that amount in penalties. Combined with legal fees and the value of the unauthorized benefits he had received, Dylan's total liability exceeded $1.2 million. More devastating than the financial judgment was the judge's finding that Dylan's conduct constituted criminal fraud. She ordered the case file to be forwarded to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for potential prosecution. Mr. Dylan Chen used sophisticated deception to steal his brother's company while that brother was unconscious and recovering from surgery, Judge Sullivan stated. This conduct represents a level of calculated betrayal that demands both civil and criminal consequences. Dylan was also permanently barred from any involvement in Zenith Flow's operations and stripped of all partnership rights. The company I had built was entirely mine again, but Dylan would face years of legal and financial consequences for his attempted theft. As the courtroom cleared, Dylan approached me one final time. His arrogance had been replaced by desperate pleading. "Marcus, we're family. We can work something out privately. The criminal charges, the financial judgment, we both know I can't pay that. This will destroy me." I looked at my brother. The person who had shared my childhood, who had been present for every major milestone in my life, who I had trusted with my most valuable creation. The brother I remembered was gone, replaced by someone capable of betraying family bonds for financial gain. "You destroyed yourself," I replied quietly. "I gave you every opportunity to be a real partner, to build something together. Instead, you chose to steal what I had built while I was fighting for my life. There's no coming back from that." Dylan's legal troubles were just beginning. The criminal investigation revealed additional evidence of his deception, including recorded phone conversations where he had bragged to friends about taking over my business during my breakdown. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office filed multiple felony charges including fraud, theft by deception, and abuse of power of attorney. The civil judgment proved impossible for Dylan to satisfy. His personal assets were insufficient to cover even a fraction of his liability, and he was forced into bankruptcy within 6 months of the court ruling. His professional reputation was destroyed, making future employment in business management virtually impossible. Meanwhile, Zenith Flow recovered rapidly from Dylan's unauthorized management. The contract concessions he had made were successfully renegotiated based on the fraudulent circumstances of their execution. Employees who had been confused by Dylan's false narrative about my condition welcomed my return with genuine enthusiasm. Our client relationships, built over years of reliable service, remained strong despite the temporary disruption. Sarah and I married 8 months after the court ruling, in a small ceremony attended by friends and employees who had supported me through the crisis. Elena Martinez was promoted to Chief Operating Officer, her loyalty and integrity during the darkest period of my life, earning her a permanent place in Zenith Flow's leadership. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach business relationships and family dynamics. Trust, I learned, must be built on verified actions rather than assumed bonds. The legal protections I had considered excessive when drafting our partnership agreement proved to be the very mechanisms that saved my company and exposed Dylan's betrayal. Most importantly, I discovered that betrayal, while devastating, doesn't have to be defining. Dylan's attempt to destroy me ultimately made Zenith Flow stronger, my relationships more genuine, and my success more meaningful. The tumor was gone from my brain, and the cancer of deception had been cut from my business. Today, Zenith Flow Logistics employs over 200 people and generates $15 million in annual revenue. We've expanded into 6 western states and maintained our reputation for reliability and integrity. The company Dylan tried to steal has become more successful than he ever imagined possible. As for Dylan, he served 18 months in federal prison for wire fraud and was released to supervised probation and court-ordered restitution payments that will follow him for the rest of his life. We haven't spoken since the day of the court ruling, and I have no plans to reconcile with someone who proved capable of such calculated betrayal. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from achieving your goals, but from surviving someone else's attempt to destroy them. Dylan thought he was stealing my company, but he actually taught me the most valuable lesson of my business career, that the contracts we write to protect ourselves from strangers are nothing compared to the character we need to protect ourselves from family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.